All right. Observational research. Topic 9. We're getting there, people. We have to get through this video and then 2 more videos, and then we are done with the content. So then it's up to you to do the quizzes, the exams, and the article briefs, and the mock surveys, and the mock interviews. By the way, my YouTube analytics shows that you people are only watching like 9 minutes of these videos and then Xing out. Would you just sit in one of my lectures and walk out 9 minutes later? Isn't this kind of trippy? No? Okay. All right, so observational research. Let's get it off the ground, son. So observational research or field research, these are terms you can use interchangeably, but field research typically involves both observations and asking questions. So one of the things that you should understand is that even though we talked about interviews separately earlier, you can still do interviews while you're observing. So usually when I'm conducting observational research and I am with, let's say, a police officer, like oftentimes my observational research involves me doing like 1 billion ride-alongs with police officers. And during those ride-alongs, I have unstructured interviews with those officers, right? So sometimes you can ask questions, sometimes you don't, depending on what you're trying to get. So field research then involves you doing observations and interviews in the natural setting, okay? We're going to talk mostly today about just the observational side of it, since we talked about the interview side of it the other day. But, so even though we talked about interviews separately, you can still do them as part of field research. But field research is when you're in the field, right? I can do some interviews not in the field. I can call a bunch of police officers and say, hey, come to my office, let me interview you, right? That's not field research. But I can do a ride-along with a police officer and conduct a semi-structured interview or a unstructured or a structured interview with them while I'm doing the ride-along, so while I'm observing. So that would be considered field research. Field research can be both qualitative or quantitative, but most of the time it's qualitative. Right, but we're going to go over when it will be quantitative and when it will be qualitative. And most of the time, you don't have a precise hypothesis that you're testing. You're not saying, if I go on this ride along, then this will happen. Or if I see this, then this will happen. Usually, you do field research when you want to explore or describe things. Right? Oh, I want to explore what, we know that there's a lot of crime. There's this high police activity in this one area, but what exactly is it coming from, right? I want to describe what this neighborhood looks like, or I want to explore who the main actors are that are committing crime in this neighborhood, right? Something like that. You want to make sense of an ongoing process. So there can also be some explanatory components to it, but most of the time it is descriptive or exploratory when you don't really know much of what's going on. You're just exploring a situation. Cute. All right. So ethnography, which is a large part of field research, which is a popular aspect of field research, involves when you're going into the field and you are trying to create a description. You're doing descriptive research, and your main focus is just on describing whatever you're focusing on to a very detailed extent, so that when the reader reads it, or when the consumer of your research reads about your research, they understand exactly what you observed, right? You're bringing that observation out to them. And so there are 4 ways that you can observe as an ethnographer. You have, and now just understand that these are mainly theoretical categories. And so sometimes in the real world, you'll spill from one to the other, but these are just theoretical categories to help you understand, right, the ways that you can observe things. Depending on what your research question is, you will take on a different role. If you want to learn more about these roles, and you can read Gold 1969. So a complete participant is someone who participates in, who becomes sort of a part of the natural setting there without anybody knowing that they are a researcher. So let's say I'm studying the police, right? I might sign up to become a police officer. There's actually been or I at least know of one criminal justice researcher. This guy wanted to study the police, so he became a police officer, right? So you apply to be a police officer. You go through the academy, right? I mean, they might know your identity. They might not know your purpose, right? And you're just learning about the situation. You're learning about policing. Sometimes you don't even tell them who you are. You make up some fake name. You might be studying some criminal activity, right? Like drug dealers or pot smokers or or whatever, and at that point people don't know why you're there, right? So there's a lot of deception involved, but it's not like you're outright lying to people necessarily. You're just sort of part of the setting. You know what I mean? You're a complete participant. You're part of the setting, right? And so people aren't asking you, hey, are you a researcher? And then you're lying to them. You're just sort of observing what's happening in the real world, being part of the real world, right? But the problem with this complete participant aspect or a role is that you can sometimes what they call go local. It's where you lose sight of being a researcher. You're losing sight of the overall purpose of your study, and you start internalizing the values and the norms of the people that you are studying. So you might be a complete participant with police officers. You might become a police officer, and police culture is very different from normal culture, right? It's super conservative. It's super suspicious of everyone, right? People value, like, police officers sort of become their own little group of friends because no one is like them, right? There's not very many people that are like police officers, right? And so you might start internalizing some patrol culture or police culture. And that might then impact the way that you observe, the way that you record data, and the way that you interpret that data. And then you get the participant as observer role. So people know what your position is. So when I was in graduate school, I did a study, or I was part of a study where I played the participant as observer role. So we were studying juvenile probation officers and how they interviewed their clients. So how did these juvenile probation officers go about their day, and how did they deal with their clients, right? So part of this was interviewing, part of this was just straight observation. And so the juvenile probation officers knew that I was a researcher. However, I had to go through the internship process. So I actually became an intern, right, at this court system, which then the juvenile system was a part of that, right? So I became an intern there. I did everything that an intern did, but everyone knew that I was a researcher. And so the probation officers, when I went with them, when I dealt with them, when I helped them with stuff, they knew I was a researcher, so they kind of treated me like a researcher, right? But I still participated in certain administrative activities, right? I still did all the stuff that interns had to do, right? But when I was with the probation officers, I was also recording data. Then you have the observer as participant role, where people know that you're a researcher, right? And you don't actually participate in the group. So this is what I did for my dissertation research, where I studied how police officers used body cameras during their daily work, right? So the police officers knew I was a researcher. I wasn't wearing a badge. I didn't have a gun. I wasn't arresting people. I wasn't doing anything like that. But I was riding along with the officers, doing everything, going everywhere that they were going. I had to wear a bulletproof vest. I saw some crazy stuff. So you see a lot of dead people, right? But they knew I was a researcher. They didn't expect me to do any of the work they did. And sometimes they told me, hey, look, this is really dangerous. Go sit in the car. Right? So all I did was I collected data as I followed them through their regular day. So I did nothing that the police would do. Then you have the complete observer role, where you observe things without becoming a participant. So the people you are observing might not even know who you are. You might just be blending in. Right? So let's say I go stand on a street corner and I'm watching the police arrest someone, right? The police don't know who I am. Right? The person who's being arrested doesn't know who I am. I'm just observing what's going on there and taking notes. Now, each of these roles, the complete participant, the participant as observer, the observer as participant, and the complete observer, they each have their benefits and drawbacks based on whatever your research question or your purpose is. With the complete participant thing, right, you will get a very, very deep understanding of what you're studying, because you are a part of it. You are living it, right? You go and you become a police officer. You arrest people. You fear for your life when you're in some of those difficult situations. However, you may also go local, right? You might internalize some of their views. With participant as observer, people know you're a researcher. So when you're participating, I remember, for instance, I'll give you an example. When I did that research in grad school, where I was following these probation officers, they tried to shield me from certain things. They didn't want, because even though I was an intern, right, I did intern stuff, right, they still knew I was also a researcher, right? And there were certain situations where they shielded me from, because they didn't want me to see how they interacted with the school principal or what happened with certain clients, like things that might look bad, right? So but they knew I was a researcher. So they understood I was there to collect data as well. And I was able to have conversations with them. I was able to ask them questions as a researcher. Whereas when you're a complete participant, you can ask people questions, but at some point it's like, why are you asking me these questions? This is weird. Right? But as a participant, as observer, even though I was doing everything, I was sort of experiencing some similar experiences to the people I was observing, but I was also able to ask them questions. Now, the full experience I was getting was not the same as someone who would be a complete participant. Then as an observer, as participant, right, I don't have to worry about necessarily going local, because I'm not doing what police officers are doing. I'm not doing what the people are doing. I am just there as a researcher. Everyone knows I am there as a researcher, but I am following them throughout their days. So the problem with that, though, is that I'm not doing what they're doing. I don't get the full experience. They might be shielding me from certain things. I remember oftentimes I had to toss out ride-along data when I'd get into an officer's car, and the officer would be like, okay, let's go take you to something cool. And I'm like, dude, I don't want to see that. I want to see what you're doing on your day-to-day work. I want to see what you're doing normally, right? But the officer would be like, let's go find something cool for you to observe, right? That messes with the whole scientific natural setting concept, right? So, but if I were a complete participant, it wouldn't be a problem. And then as a complete observer, you get a full overhead view of what's happening. You're not necessarily biased, right? Because if I'm sitting with a cop all day, right? I might be a little biased because I'm learning about this person. I'm learning about their views. I'm starting to see the world through their eyes. But as a complete observer, you're away from that. You're third party. But there's no opportunity for you to ask questions, for people to clarify things. You can't mess with the situation. But at the same time, you're not part of the situation at all. Right? If you see a cop beating the crap out of someone, that cop doesn't know that you're doing research. That cop doesn't know that you're there to collect data. So you see what's actually happening. Right? So those are so depending on what you want to know, how much you want to describe, what you want to explore, you need to take on a different role. Now, with some of these things like complete participant, you're going to have a tough time with the IRB. Whereas that might not be so much the case with the complete observer situation. So each of these has their perks. Each of these has their limitations. So like we just discussed, right? Depending on what you want to do, you need to decide which type of role you're going to take on. Now, one thing to consider when you're deciding which role to take on is called reactivity. So I've alluded to this, and that's reactivity. So that's when subjects' behavior or opinions are impacted by knowing that you are conducting research. Right? This is an issue that you can safeguard against based on the way that you behave as a researcher. For instance, I remember the very first time I ever did observational research. I was following this police officer, and whenever the officer was saying something so what you usually do is when you're conducting observational research is you have like a tiny little notepad with you. It's a very small book. It's like, the size of like an index card. And so I would just like scribble things down just to remember things, right? So that when I got home, I would write my notes. So what happened was we were called to a woman someone said there was a woman walking down the street and she looked just out of place, right? She looked like she was on drugs or something. And so we stopped this woman. We found her, we stopped her, and yeah, she was very skinny. She looked like she was on drugs. And then the officer started talking to her and asking her questions. And every time he asked her a question, I would jot down a little note. And I would notice he was looking at me every time I jotted something down, right? And anyway, so that we got through that situation, and we ended up not arresting the woman because she wasn't actually doing anything wrong. She was definitely on drugs, but we couldn't prove that she was on drugs, right? And she didn't have any drugs on her after we searched her and everything. So, but then after that, I noticed the officer was getting, like, people were saying, hey, there's stuff going down in this beat, and the officer was waiting for other people to first take that call, right? And then would instead just pull someone over for speeding. And I realized the way I was taking notes, that officer might have thought that I was recording things about his behavior that was critical, or I was being critical when I was recording his behavior. So the officer changed his behavior because of my presence. There's been other cases too where I get into the car and they said, hey, do you want to see like a DUI or something? We can go grab a DUI real quick. We can find someone doing DUIs, right? And I was like, how do you just find them? But I was like, no, just do your regular day. And they're like, well, I usually go walk my dog now. I'm like, well, let's go walk your dog, bro. So reactivity is when their behavior changes because they know you're a researcher, right? There was another case where when I was doing that probation officer stuff, the juvenile probation officer stuff, I remember the probation officer I was following that day, we went to a school where one of the probation clients, she kept on getting in trouble for skipping school. And so at some point, this probation officer, the principal kept on like kicking her out of school, like suspending her for skipping school. And so the probation officer's like, what the hell are you doing? By like her mom She doesn't have a dad. Her mom works all day, so you're just giving her more opportunity to get into trouble, right? And this principles of policy is policy, and all of a sudden these two are in a massive screaming fight with each other, and I'm just standing there, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so awkward, right? And afterwards, the woman, the probation officer, she says to me, she's like, man, I've been trying all day for you to not see something like that. And I was like, are you kidding me? You've been trying to shield me from the stuff I was trying to record. So she essentially just told me that the whole day, her schedule, what she's been doing, has been impacted by my presence. So I couldn't include that data, right? Because it was reactive. It wasn't real. It wasn't true. It wasn't valid. Right? So it really sucks when you notice that your presence has impacted them. So the way to overcome reactivity is to be careful on how and when you take notes. Be careful of what types of questions you're asking when you're in the field. And to not talk too much about what about your role as an academic or as a student or something, right? Just to let things happen naturally. And what I noticed, however, is that once I started doing a couple ride-alongs, I would do additional ride-alongs, and I became more of a natural fixture at the police agency, and then things became normal. People got used to me, right? And then the reactivity reduces. But whenever I noticed, like, I remember we did, like, at this one place where I did research, I can't mention the name of the place, but we did a bunch of ride-alongs where we ended up seeing 176 citizen encounters. And I ended up having to exclude a bunch of them where we could only use 149 because the rest of them all involved some sort of reactivity. It's where we noticed there was reactivity, so we kicked it out. And some of those were really good. Some of those where there was a bunch of force used, right? And those are great observations when you see the officers throw down with someone, but you can't use it, right? Or see someone overdosing on drugs, right? You guys should definitely do police ride-alongs at some point, especially now that it's summertime. That's when crime picks up, and people are outside committing crime. So, okay, so remember when we talked about sampling, snowball sampling, and purposive sampling? Well, this is like, you very, very seldom will use probability sampling when you're doing observations, but it is possible. It is possible to do probability sampling depending on your research design. But most of the time, we will use non-probability sampling. And so what we have to understand with that is that when it comes to observational research, right, where we're using snowball sampling, right, when I first started my police research, right, you have to ask a police officer, hey, do you know who I can hit up? Who you think will do a ride-along with me? Because a lot of police officers don't like doing ride-alongs with people from the public. So there is a snowballing aspect to it. Or a purposive sample where you're like, I'm looking for certain types of police officers, right? And so you're not randomly selecting people. You are seeking out certain types of people. So this is good for field research because field research focuses on a specific thing. You're exploring or trying to describe a specific thing, but you can't generalize because you didn't randomly or systematically select them. Now you can do you can do probability sampling, but it just depends on what your research question is and what your design is going to be. So there are many ways to record observations in the field, but you want to be careful when you're recording observations and how you're recording them. Also, depending on the role that you're taking, you might not be able to record things right as they're happening. So you want to be careful. I'll tell you this, do not just go on observations and take 0 notes because your memory will fail you. So what I would do is when I was doing observational research, and I was doing this as observer as participant style, I would have a tiny little notepad with me, and I would jot just one word down here and there whenever I had a chance. However, I would do it after a situation occurred. I would do it when me and the officer were just sort of getting ready to get back on the road again. I would jot tiny little things down, maybe some descriptors about the citizens that were involved, the type of crime that occurred, just so that when I read that, it reminds me again of the whole situation. But I didn't want to take too many notes because like I learned right in the beginning of my research is that when you're taking notes in the situation, it might put the officer on edge. The officer might feel like you're judging them or recording them or writing things about them, right? And so you want to just be discreet, be quick, and just put down just enough information to jog your memory. And so what I would do is, so when I was collecting my data for my dissertation, I would have, so it was like an hour and a half drive to and from the agency where I was collecting my data. So after I would leave to go back home, I would have my little notepad out. I had a voice recorder, and as I was driving, I would start reciting what I remembered about the things. And then when I got home, I would listen to those recordings and I would type up my notes. That way I was able to get very, very detailed information. And the more I thought about the situation, the more I remembered more details, right? So don't just trust your memory, right? Note everything that you think is important at the time. The problem with that, though, is, and this is just one of the downsides of this type of field research, is that, you have selective memory. You have selective attention, right? And you have to be aware of that, and you have to pay attention to the fact that you could only be focusing on certain things. So depending on your research question, you might want to focus on, okay, am I just fixating on this one officer? Am I just fixating on this thing or on that thing, right? Should I be looking at things more broadly, right? It just all depends on what you're trying to get at. But be careful when you're taking notes in the field because that can cause some reactivity, right? So the nice thing about observations is that they do offer a lot of validity. However, validity can be compromised when there is reactivity. So when people know that you're a researcher, or when they start changing their behavior because you are with them, then your validity goes out the door. But when that is not a case, when there's no reactivity, you are able to get really good information. And when you're reviewing all the interview transcripts, so especially when you are conducting when you're conducting observations and asking questions at the same time. There's been so many times where I did a ride along, and then after the situation is done, I asked the officer, so what were you trying to accomplish there? What were your motivations? What did you see that I didn't see, right? And then that just adds much more validity to what you've observed. But the problem is reliability, right? One observer might interpret things differently than another observer, right? Also, your attention span as an observer, it goes out the door at some point, right? I try not to do ride-alongs for longer than 4 hours because at some point you just get tired. You don't remember everything correctly. So you're much more valid, or you're collecting data better in the beginning, and then towards the end you start slacking, right? So that's not reliability. You're not collecting the data at the same quality as you did at first. So your mind needs to be sharp so that when you're collecting data, you remember, okay, now I'm at one situation, I'm collecting data a certain way. When I'm at this next situation, I got to do it the exact same way again. So I usually have a little sheet of paper with me that I carry with me where I'm like, okay, look for these things. Ask these questions afterwards, so that drawing similar data out of each individual experience. So those of you who don't remember, this is validity and reliability. All right, this is a cool little picture here. Right? When you're reliable, you're picking things up the same way each time. But it's not necessarily valid. You're not getting that bullseye. You're not getting the truth. When it's when it's not reliable nor valid, it's just not even close to the bullseye, and it's sort of all over the place. But when it's both reliable and valid, you get the bullseye each time. It's like when I play darts. So just like interviews, observations can also be very structured or they can be very unstructured. Now, with structured observations, you typically have a close-ended questionnaire. Let me show you, like on the next page here. Right, you see like that? It says, look for certain things and then check off when you see them, right? This gives you a lot more reliability than an unstructured observation, like the ones I typically do, right? These are, you're looking for certain things and you quantify how many times certain things were present. How many times did you see a prostitute on the street corner? How many times did you see a broken window? How many times did you see a car driving past? Or, when you stand on a street corner, how many bicycles do you see? How many gas cars do you see? How many hybrid cars do you see? Right? It's very structured and it's a close-ended questionnaire. And so when you have that, you have high reliability. These are perfect examples of most structured observations are environment surveys. This is when you are observing something about the conditions of an environment. So you can be looking at social conditions. Well, how many people who seem to be homeless are walking around? How many prostitutes, how many drug dealers are posting up, right? Or you could be looking at physical conditions like broken windows, other forms of social disorganization. You can be looking at like actual environmental stuff like climate change related stuff, how many dead animals or whatever, how much ice is melting, I don't know, okay? And you can also do environmental surveys in an unstructured manner, but most of the time they are structured. For crime reasons, we typically will have a structured environmental survey, and we will tick off how many times we see certain types of criminal activities occur, or when we'll be in a hot spot, we'll be like, well, we'll learn how to describe certain aspects of that hot spot with a close-ended questionnaire. Now, this is useful for your article briefs, right? If you are going to brief an article that involved observational research, right, be aware of the strengths and the weaknesses. The nice thing about observational research is there's flexibility, right? If you didn't anticipate something, that you would encounter something before, you can roll with it and you'll be able to collect that data. You'll get a high validity, right? You can study criminal justice people in the natural setting. You can follow police officers, see how they deal with things. You can study active offenders in their natural setting. So you get a much deeper understanding of what's happening with observational research or with field research, especially when you're asking questions in addition to observing. However, you are getting a very deep, intense view of one situation, and so you can't generalize. So that's a weakness, right? Reliability will often be an issue. You can't study a large population. You can't follow 2,000 people with that amount of intensity. Just think if you did 4-hour ride-alongs with 2,000 police officers. That's going to take you ages, man. It's going to be forever. Just think if you have to write up all those notes. And then when you have to analyze all those notes, it's so much data. And you can't often pull probability samples. So then, again, generalizability is an issue. So when it comes to the strengths, you get a lot of validity, you get a lot of deep understanding, you get to see things in its natural setting, but the weaknesses are you can't generalize, you can't look at large populations, and you can't do probability sampling, which means you can't do a lot of good statistics. Okay, so what I'm noticing on my YouTube is that you guys aren't actually listening to, or are not actually watching these videos all the way through. So to reward those who do watch these things all the way through, on your first article brief at the very end, after you've written everything, at the very end, I want you to write in all caps, cheese bagel. If you've written in all caps, cheese bagel at the end of your article brief 1 assignment, I will give you 2 extra credit points towards your final grade, because then I know you've listened to this video all the way through. And I will leave you with a beautiful song.